Welcome zombies. In today's video we're exploring Royalton and Sharon, Vermont, and I'll also include a little bit of Springfield, Vermont. I found some cool photos of Springfield that I think will be worth sharing. But the reason I ended up in the Royalton, Sharon area is because in between those two cities is a site called the Joseph Smith Memorial Birthplace. And Joseph Smith is the founder of the Mormon religion, what most people know as the Mormon religion. And the Mormon religion, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, is heavily intertwined with early American history. And in fact, you can't really study, or at least do a real study, a thorough study, an honest study of the story that we're given of early American history without at least reading a little bit about the Mormons, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, who took all the Mormons to Utah, as we're told, and they helped, as we're told, open up a whole lot of the West Coast and that sort of thing. So I wanted to come visit the Joseph Smith Memorial Birthplace and see what's there, and I highly recommend that. Well, first of all, I recommend that you watch all these videos in order, starting with episode 1 and then just watch them through that way. But if you haven't done that, or you don't, you're not going to do that, then before you watch this one, honestly, I would highly recommend that you watch the Hiram, Ohio video that I did, and also the Palmyra, New York video that I did. And you can go to playlist and click into the state of Ohio and the state of New York and get to those videos easily that way. And what I like to do with these videos is show leftovers, remnants, and evidences of previous advanced, prosperous human civilizations here in these lands that really looks like they are leftovers from the Egyptian people, the Greek people, the Roman people, as we think of them. And it just so happens that Joseph Smith translated a book that's known as the Book of Mormon that talks specifically about descendants of Egyptians, Romans, Jews, Greeks in these lands that were extremely prosperous, very industrious, very populous, and very advanced, that got wiped out. And not only just once, but multiple times. And I believe that that is what we're looking at, is leftovers of those peoples. And if you're wondering, I'm sure some of you are, why I make these videos, why I've gone to see these sites. First of all, let me just say, I never thought I would be making these videos. I was just kind of set out to answer some questions that I had personally. And the more I looked into it, and the more I read and studied, the more it just looks like the stories in the Book of Mormon is the truth, is the real stories of where all this architecture is coming from and what happened to the people that built all this architecture, because it wasn't cowboys in the 1700s and 1800s, because that just doesn't make sense. That does not add up. And so I guess now at this point, why am I making these videos? It's fun. It's been very fun to visit these places, and it's fun to do the research online and see what stories are there and find old photos and share it. But I think more importantly, if there was one thing I would hope, or one kind of thing I'm trying to point people towards, is probably this story that I'm going to share in this video, and that I shared bits of in the Hiram, Ohio and the Palmyra, New York video, which is that there's a book, the Book of Mormon, that got translated by someone who called himself a prophet of God, which is a huge claim to make. And that book just so happens to really explain perfectly where this architecture in these lands would come from and why it matches perfectly the Egyptian architecture of the ancient world that we think of, the old world, the Roman and Greek architecture and all of that. And so read the Book of Mormon is basically what I'm trying to get at, because I think that book has way more truth in it than any history book or science or whatever channel from mainstream whatever. And so on my just kind of interest in things, I wanted to come visit the Joseph Smith Memorial Birthplace Memorial, and see what was there. So along with that, we'll also be checking out the Royalton and Sharon, Vermont cities. So first, as usual, let's take a look from my airship. And we are on the east coast of what we call the United States of America, in the state of Vermont. We're like northeast here. And I mean, look, interesting that when I hover my mouse over Royalton, we already start to see an obelisk, which is Egyptian, Greek, Roman architecture. And in my video on Bennington, my Bennington, Vermont video, I cover obelisks. I mean, not the whole video, but a really large percentage of that video is all about obelisks and how many there are all over America that are leftovers and remnants of these civilizations that used to be here. And we'll be seeing another obelisk today here in this area. So I'll zoom in here, get a little closer look. So this square I've got outlined is Royalton, and you'll see right at the top right of it is the Joseph Smith Memorial Birthplace. And as you can start to see right there, obelisk. And if you pay attention to the icon that it's showing us to mark it, it's a little castle looking icon. So we'll just note that. And then Sharon, Vermont is just a little ways down the river right here. Right here. So Joseph Smith was born in 1805 and murdered, I believe, in 1844. And he was murdered pretty much by the GOV, okay? And if you go back and read, you know, what he had to say about a lot of things, he wasn't very happy with the GOV of the land and how it was supposed to be all about freedom and all that, because what he found is that it wasn't, even to the point where they took his life over it. And yes, there's a lot more to that story, but I just mentioned that because, I mean, we're seeing the evidences, the architecture of previous advanced prosperous civilizations, but the story we're fed from the GOV is that no, just wood cabin, log people, and Indians in their teepees is all that was ever here. But that's just not true. And he knew that. He translated a book that told all about that, and he had his life taken for it. And ever since then, that same GOV has just been writing their stories and owning everything. And if we look right here on the Sharon, Vermont history page, we'll see just this again, that in the mid 20th century, the main form of employment in Sharon was still the lumber industry. So mid 20th century, I know some people have no idea what that means. That means mid 1900s. 20th century means 1900, 21st century means the early 2000s. A century is 100 years long. If it was the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s. Just to clear that up for some people who might be a little bit confused about what that is actually saying. So it's saying that in the 1900s, mid 1900s, lumber was still the main industry, which is interesting because we're going to be looking at rock, just like we saw in Palmyra, New York, just like we saw in Ohio and everywhere else. The story we've been fed is lumber, wood, lumber, cabins, teepees, but when you go look at all the leftover architecture, it's all rock, it's stone, it's marble, it's huge arches, it's buried windows, it's not matching at all this whole wood cabin narrative. And as far as other information about Royalton or Sharon, Vermont that's worth mentioning, there's not really much there. So I thought we'd kind of, and I'll show you some more of the city, but just as far as like information that it gives us, not a whole lot. But on the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial Wiki page, there's some interesting things that I think are worth taking a look at. So first of all, and I'll show you the whole site here, it's really cool. There's definitely some old remnants and just really interesting things to look at. But one of the main ones is the obelisk. There's a very large granite obelisk that sits right there. And we can see right here the monument stands 50 feet tall and weighs approximately 100 tons, which is 200,000 pounds. And it says that the monument was put up in 1905 and was a remarkable engineering feat and one of the largest polished shafts in the world. Calling it a remarkable engineering feat is honestly a huge understatement for 1905. This thing weighing 200,000 pounds, 50 feet tall, for Cowboys, yeah, remarkable engineering feat, okay. And one of the largest in the world, okay. And this is what I mean by leftovers, remnants. I believe this obelisk was already sitting here for a very long time, that no Cowboys put this up in 1905. And again, for a much more in-depth look at obelisks, ancient ones across the whole what we call United States of America, go watch my Bennington, Vermont video. There's a 300-foot tall one, perfect, out of stone there. And also in that video, I look at one that they tore down that was in New York, which was like 600 feet tall. It's just insanity. And like all the stories for him are like, oh, it's just a memorial now to someone, and they put it up in 1880 or 1910. And I believe that that's just not true. I believe these were sitting here, like I said, for a very long time, and they've just been renamed, and a story was written about them that's just simply not true, that dates it to a much newer recent date. But it's still a date that's just outside of anyone that could still be living's lifetime, so there's actually no one truly there that you could really verify it with. So it's a pretty slick way to pull off a lie, I guess you could say. But when you consider what they also say about the cabins, like, and the lumber, and that's how they built everything, well then what the heck is a pure 200,000 pound perfectly carved granite obelisk, which is ancient architecture, doing sitting right here? And not just right here, but all over the country, all over the states. I thought the word polished was interesting because that really made me wonder, because there's one that they show in New York City that has hieroglyphics all over it, and I wonder if that's, you know, why this one's so very well polished, is maybe in like 1905 or whatever, they polished the thing up, threw some new carvings on it to make it a memorial, and that's why it's super polished. But they really, maybe all they did was polish away all the hieroglyphics that were on it. And I talked about this in the Bennington video, but oftentimes gold, maybe there was, you know, very likely there was gold or different things on it like that, precious metals. And so, yeah, maybe it was just polished from its original, maybe it was, you know, sitting there already polished. But I also think that, you know, that was probably what they did. They found it, polished it, got rid of anything that was too telling on it, hieroglyphics, etc., and then put some new engravings on it to say that it's a Joseph Smith memorial. And before I read this, I just want to make it very clear, I guess, where I stand. Not that where I stand necessarily matters. I think this is all for each individual to discern, figure out for themselves. But I've mentioned this in other videos. As far as I can tell, prior to late 1800s, there was pretty much castle kingdoms all over what we call the United States of America. And then, let's just call it floods, came and buried a lot of the castles and kingdoms that were originally here, and we just see some remnants of it still poking up, like this obelisk, for example, like our Capitol buildings, for example, and like many other pieces of architecture that I'm showing in these videos. And then what happened is, after all that disaster and all this new earth settled, and now that's why we see dirt everywhere, the GOV, which are the new conquerors of this territory now after all this disaster, went around and staged content on dirt roads, and did it with actors, with props, etc., to rewrite the true story, to write a new false story. The true story is advanced, prosperous castle kingdoms in these lands. The new story that was written is poor, dirt, cabins, teepees, etc. And right here we see that it says No photographs of historic sites during Joseph Smith's lifetime are known. However, early in the 20th century, which is the early 1900s, right after the late 1800s disaster that happened all across the country, Utah photographer George Edward Anderson, driven by a need to record Latter-day Saint history, created a careful visual record of these places. Anderson visited and photographed the location of key events in early church history. He often enlivened the photographs by including people posed on site, near buildings, or working, suggesting the activities of earlier times. It sure looks to me right here, they're saying it right here, that in the early 1900s, after these late 1800s disasters, which, by the way, if you read, this is for anyone who might be Mormon, who has read a lot of Mormon doctrine, that sort of thing. If you read in Doctrine and Covenants, because they first got, like I mentioned, go watch Ohio videos, okay? The Mormons got kicked out of Ohio, and then they went to Missouri, and then they got kicked out of Missouri, for just a really simple way of putting it. And if you read in another book, which is called the Doctrine and Covenants, it explains that the Lord Jesus, speaking to Joseph, says, "Let him that goeth to the east teach them that shall be converted to flee to the west, and this in consequence of that which is coming on the earth, and of secret combinations." And then what happened is what we're reading right here. Photographers were sent out, actors were sent out, props on these new dirt roads that were everywhere, rewriting, recording a new false history. And so just want to make it very clear here, like I said at the beginning, I believe, and when you read the Book of Mormon, it's very clear that it's offering the exact explanation of where this architecture comes from and what happens to the people that built it. So I'm saying the Book of Mormon is true. I believe the Book of Mormon is true. I would recommend to anybody watching this video to read the Book of Mormon and just learn what's in it. But I'm also saying in the early 1900s, the GOV, this church right here, sent out photographers with props and actors to stage new photos, new content, which they've been rolling with ever since then, telling us a story of poor dirt people and no one ever being here previously, really, which is just not true. Joseph Smith, real prophet of God, and God instructed him to translate a book that we know as the Book of Mormon, which contains the real history of the people that used to be here in these lands before us and what happened to them. And what happened to them is they got wiped out multiple times because they stopped following God. And then I believe what happened is that's what happened in the late 1800s again. People stopped following God, and there was a wipeout, disaster that swept through all the land, burying a lot of the architecture, and that's where we get all these dirt roads from. And if you've read the Book of Mormon, you'll understand this next thing that I'm about to say. If you haven't, I recommend that you do read the Book of Mormon until you do understand what I'm about to say. Because I think what has happened, this rewriting, is Gadianton robbers and murderers have gotten in control again and have just simply rewritten things. They've made new content to feed us a false story so we don't have the full truth. But the Book of Mormon and what it teaches is real. And just like what it teaches in the Book of Mormon, the church can absolutely go astray. There can absolutely be wolves that infiltrate the church and lead it astray, that rewrite content. Even in the space of not many years, they became an exceedingly great band of robbers, and they did search out all the secret plans of Gadianton, and thus they became robbers of Gadianton. They did obtain the sole management of the government, insomuch that they did trample under their feet and smite and rend and turn their backs upon the poor and the meek and the humble followers of God. And thus we see that they were in an awful state and ripening for an everlasting destruction. And whatsoever nation shall uphold such secret combinations to get power and gain until they shall spread over the nation, behold, they shall be destroyed. It is wisdom in God that these things should be shown unto you, that thereby ye may repent of your sins. And suffer not that these murderous combinations shall get above you, which are built up to get power and gain. The Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things among you, that ye shall awake to a sense of your awful situation, because of this secret combination which shall be among you. For it cometh to pass that whoso buildeth it up seeketh to overthrow the freedom of all lands, nations, and countries, and it bringeth to pass the destruction of all people, for it is built up by the devil. Wherefore I, Moroni, am commanded to write these things, that evil may be done away, and that the time may come that Satan may have no power upon the hearts of the children of men, but that they may be persuaded to do good continually, that they may come unto the fountain of all righteousness and be saved. And in Doctrine and Covenants, it specifically says that that Joseph Smith and his followers that believed the Book of Mormon, they tried to set up in Ohio and they got kicked out of Ohio, and then they went to Missouri, and then they got kicked out of Missouri, and then they went to Illinois and they got kicked out of Illinois. And it says in Doctrine and Covenants, Jesus speaking says specifically about what happened in Missouri, that the saints failed. They weren't able to fully build Zion there because they became sinful. And so then they got booted, and since then God's people have been in a state of chastening. And now I give unto you a word concerning Zion. Zion shall be redeemed, although she is chastened for a little season. Concerning your brethren who have been afflicted and persecuted and cast out from the land of their inheritance, I, the Lord, have suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted in consequence of their transgressions. For all those who will not endure my chastening, but deny me, cannot be sanctified. Behold, I say unto you, there were jarrings, and contentions, and envyings, and strifes, and lustful and covetous desires among them. Therefore by these things they polluted their inheritances. Mine indignation is soon to be poured out without measure upon all nations. And this will I do when the cup of their iniquity is full. And in that day all who are found upon the watchtower shall be saved. There is none other place appointed than that which I have appointed. Neither shall there be any other place appointed than that which I have appointed, for the work of the gathering of my saints. Behold, here is wisdom concerning the children of Zion, even many, but not all. They were found transgressors, therefore they must needs be chastened. Scriptures. That's really what I'm trying to say here, is the Book of Mormon's real, the Joseph Smith translating it's real, the history in there and the principles in there is real, Doctrine and Covenants is real, and as it says in the Doctrine and Covenants and in the Book of Mormon, the church can be infiltrated. The people of God can be sinful to the point where they end up under a deception, etc. So again, I'm just gonna leave that there now and continue with this video. So one thing that I've learned, and I talk a lot about this in the Bennington, Vermont video, where I'm talking about obelisks, and specifically one of the obelisks in New York, which they call the Trilon, which was part of the New York World Fair Expo. And as part of that, they show you the city of tomorrow, which I explained in that video is not some futuristic city. It's actually they're taking the old, advanced, prosperous civilization city and calling it the city of tomorrow, and then they just destroy it shortly after. With that said, here's what they call Springfield. I said we'd look a little bit at Springfield, Vermont, And here's what they call Springfield, Vermont in the future. And I'm not saying this is necessarily exactly true as we're seeing it right here, but I definitely think some of this is true. For example, in many of my videos I've shown airships, and that I think air travel was definitely a thing. Up here we see two different kinds of airships. We see a train above the buildings here traveling through the city, and I've been showing that as well. Like there's in some of the fairs and expos, there were amazing monorail systems that went for miles and miles. And also just as part of this, everything getting buried, I think, and then railroads happening shortly after that. The Cowboys are building railroads and start moving stuff around. I just think railroads were largely excavated and reconnected in some places, but like rail cars, trains, railroads, a lot of it, again, just already sitting there. And I think even to the point where this is probably somewhat of a real depiction of Springfield in even just the late 1800s. I wouldn't know exactly where to date this to, and I think I don't know, these little balloon things, I don't know what those are. They kind of look like air balloons. Yeah, right there, like a guy's riding in an air balloon. Here's a look at some big brick buildings in Springfield, Vermont. It says it's I can't quite read what it says that they are, but just big brick buildings, ancient architecture on dirt roads. And I explain this in all my videos, but it just does not make sense to move that much brick around. First of all, I'm not sure you could, but let's just say you could move that much brick around, stack that much brick so perfectly with the pillars and the columns and the triangles, and perfect. But you never used any of that rock or stone to pave a road. You just decided to leave it all dirt. Just doesn't make sense. I mean, that's one of the first things we do when we go into an area for construction, is you pave a road into that area, so it makes it much easier to get in and out of and haul material in and out of. And I think in lots of cases like this right here, these big, huge, I mean, there's definitely much bigger ones than this, but these huge steel bridges that oftentimes sit on top of really old looking, perfectly stacked rock pillar structures, again, leftovers. And I think anciently their buildings were very, very tall, and they had transportations at all the levels. So, let's say there's 100 stories. I think up at the top, the top 10 stories, whatever, yeah, there were still bridges and canals and transportation and all that up there just as well as at the bottom. And so even, most of our stuff sits at ground level, but if floods came and buried 90 stories of the building, let's say 95, 96, 97 stories, there could still very well be in those top stories some bridges, some railroads, all that sort of stuff. And I believe that's what we're seeing here. This one's really interesting. So this is supposedly a temporary bridge. The picture was taken in 1916 when it's determined the metal bridge over the falls was no longer safe. And if we look right here at their new structure that they built, it's made out of wood. And so if we're the builders of all this rock, if we were the builders of this steel, why does everything just look in ruins and we're building a little dinky wood bridge? Because aren't we much better architects than that if we're building all of this that we see back here? But really what this is back here is these are ancient leftover buildings, and this is an ancient canal that ran through all the buildings. Like I mentioned before, we see in Venice, Italy or something like that. And it's just gone through a lot of disaster and decommissioned, and we are the wood people. Our ancient ancestors were the rock builders, and we're the new wood people that show up and figure out how to make some of this stuff work. And this is what it used to look like. Beautiful rushing waters with waterfalls and ancient rock architecture sitting right alongside the water. Here's another look at a steel bridge, and this is what I mean by steel bridges, amazing design sitting on top of huge ancient rock pillars that are supporting the bridge. And to me, just more leftover architecture and engineering that we just discovered, that we inherited, you could say. This is a factory in Springfield, and look how big this thing is. Again, sitting right on the water. And this is just a huge complex, all made out of rock. Big tower right there. And I believe much of this has been demolished since then. This is a high school in Springfield. I guess it might have been a couple things, because right here it says apartments. Okay, so maybe this one's the high school then in Springfield, Vermont. But again, just another piece of a castle. This reminds me a little bit of the high school in Canajoharie, New York. And I've mentioned in a lot of my videos that the story they give us is this one right here. Horse and wood cart is how they hauled all of the rock to build all of these buildings, and it all happened on dirt roads. And you almost never see any actual rock being hauled. Maybe you'll see some lumber, but never really any rock or stone being hauled. In this case, hard to tell because it's blurry. Like honestly, we don't really know from this picture if this is rock. But let's just say this is, as they're saying, a large stone of granite. 2, 4, 6, 8 horses to move that, if it is a stone of granite. And they would need to move a whole lot of blocks just like that to build all these buildings. Like that one stone right there it could be the size of one stone of the obelisk that I show in Bennington. And so not only do they have to transport, I don't know how many, definitely tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of those, but then they also have to stack it super, super high and stack it perfectly. And to me, this is how we read. They went around to the different places and they actors and props and took photos to show a new story. I believe that's what we're seeing right here is, let's make it look like 2, 4, 6, 8 horses in a wood cart hauling one, are we really even sure if it's granite block, is how they transported everything and built everything. And so here's another look at Springfield, Vermont, maybe the main street or something like that. But again, when I just sit here and look at this, all those buildings alongside of this are rock. And then you can see the one down here in the distance with a huge tower on it. And everything looks, these buildings do not look new. They don't look freshly put up. They look like they've been there for a very long time. They show weathering on them. They're all made out of rock. And you've got the old ancient pillars right here, huge towers, and just dirt roads and some wood wheels. And this looks like, if you stop and spend a second with it, again, this doesn't look like these people came and built a new city. It looks like there's an old buried city here, and they started to show up and occupy it. And with that said, now we'll look at some pictures of Royalton, which is where the obelisk is at, the Joseph Smith Memorial Obelisk. And unfortunately, this is a very blurry photo, but I think we're pretty much seeing the same thing here, where there's a huge obelisk already sticking up in the middle of a bunch of dirt. And people in this case are showing up to it, having a look at it, taking a picture with it, and then eventually at some point it gets turned into a memorial. But this is an ancient obelisk sitting here in a buried city. And then just like we saw in Springfield, here's a look at Royalton. We see air travel and we see a monorail above the city at an incline. And then we see dirt roads and all the rock architecture already there. And I might talk a little bit more about this throughout the video. I've definitely talked about it in previous videos. But this hill that we're seeing out here is a perfect shape of a temple or a pyramid. And I think that's probably the case. And I think it's just been covered up with some dirt and some new shrubbery. Simple as that. Because if you took an old pyramid and you covered it up in some dirt and shrubbery, that's exactly what it would look like. Oh, so I guess I got another look at that photo that's a little crispier. Just look at all this dirt in front of it. And look how this thing, again, weighing 200,000 pounds. And so there's also this construction photo, which I find very interesting. They say this is the train hauling some granite from the quarry. And again, a little bit hard to tell, but this could very, very, very easily just be a tree stump. Sure, call it a stone quarry, but again, could very just easily be a piece of a tree right there. And with the M and G carved on it, it would be pretty easy to carve that into a tree stump than a piece of granite. And here's some more of the photos that photographer that they sent out to recreate content. This one's apparently in 1912 with some actors sitting right out in front of it here, just like they said they did, right out in front of the obelisk. Again, right here, I mean, look at this. Mowing the lawn, playing croquet. This is just posed. It's posed, staged content. And they said as much. Here's a look at it from a little different angle. Dirt, a little bit of grass, little fence around the obelisk. But I mean, for how massive this obelisk is, and when everything's dirt, and this is like really out of the way, just sitting here already. Here's another shot of a mountain that could easily be the shape of a pyramid with very new life on top of it. I mean, look, you can even see some of the lines, like the different step levels to it. You can still make that out even with some of the bushes on top of it. And look, you can see some of the rock of it poking through right there. It's just an old pyramid, and it's really as simple as that. There's just a little bit of new life on top of it. Like this isn't even old. These aren't even old trees or old shrubbery. This is pretty recent life sitting on top of it. Okay, and here's currently a look at the obelisk on the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial Site. Very impressive, perfectly cut, pure granite obelisk. And you can see it's got these two houses. They're symmetrical on each side, and some old stone that it looks like that they're constructed of, along with the old stone and the steps leading up to the obelisk. And here's a look at what it looks like from above, so you can see a little bit more of the symmetry that's there. And like I mentioned, it's kind of just out of the way. And so if they're moving a 200,000 pound obelisk that far out of the way and throwing it up there, and they do provide some construction photos, or they say on the site here. So they say this top one is the quarry that it came from, and then this one is how they transported it. They got some horses and some wood carts back here to transport the 200,000 pound obelisk. And then they say that the polished granite shaft, one of the largest in the world, was lifted into the place, they just say, by special rigging. And this special rigging is again all made out of wood. Like, if you're that good with stone, I just don't know here. I'm not sure, could be photoshopped. I like, this wouldn't be hard. So I don't know. Again, I definitely lean towards it just already being here. But if you want a construction photo, that's what they give you. And then they say that the monument was dedicated on December 23rd, 1905, the 100th anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth on the site. And they have this little area marked out, and they give this plaque saying that this is where the hearthstone used to be, and this is where they washed, dressed, and cuddled Joseph Smith when he was born, the future organizer of God's Kingdom Restored. Which I know I definitely haven't told the whole story. I probably will make a video where I do a much more in-depth, like, LDS, Mormon, Church, Joseph Smith, Book of Mormon history and all that sort of thing. But that was basically, the story goes, God, Jesus, called Joseph Smith to be a prophet, just like God called Moses to be a prophet way back in the day, and to translate the Book of Mormon so that we have a real history of our ancient ancestors, of this land, of God's dealings with these people and this land, and why they got wiped out, how to not get wiped out, all that sort of thing, how to live, how God would have us live. And as part of that, he was to restore God's kingdom. And that's why when, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I've mentioned a couple times in other videos, but they were sent to Missouri, which was supposed to be the New Zion. And then that's why it says in the Doctrine and Covenants that the saints failed there and they weren't able to maintain Zion and got kicked out. And since then, we've been in a state of chastening, captivity, bondage, etc. But that was the goal. And God has tried, the scriptures are full of this, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, where God speaks to a people, gives his commands, you could say, and says, look, if you want to build a kingdom that is, my kingdom, then here's how you can do it. But it requires a lot of righteousness. There's a lot of stuff that is natural to us humans. We're evil in lots of ways, and God's kingdom can't have any of that in it. And so there's been several times where God said, okay, here's how you can do it, and then the people kind of do it for a little bit, but then allow too much evil inside of it, and so eventually God has to wipe it all out again. And that's the story of God, Joseph Smith, Book of Mormon, giving us, the people back then, another chance at that, and we see basically another failure at it. And so this is and that's what it means by, on this plaque right here, by he was the future organizer of God's kingdom restored. And then there's this little trail back here that I'll drive us down, and we'll see some more ruins back here. And it says that it leads to the remains of Old Turnpike Road and a section of the original wall which paralleled it. Also the foundations of a couple other residences and an old stone bridge typical of the Joseph Smith era. So here's a look at one of the sites, and they basically say this is the foundation for the cabins that they built, and I just don't really know what to make of it. Are these true leftover remnants, or did they just come place some rocks here at some point? I'm not sure. Yeah, so it says this right here was part of the old cellar of the old home that used to be here. And yeah, I don't know. It almost just looks like some boulders were placed here. This one's interesting. Well, an old stone bridge, and they're even saying on this one that was here before 1804, which that definitely makes sense. I think some of these old stone bridges were here probably even long before that. And I'm not quite sure what they're saying is the stone bridge, whether it's that piece or they've paved a road on top of what used to be the old bridge right there. And then also on the site, down a little ways, there's this church, which we look right here, it's this old stone. We got the old perfect triangle right there, huge steeple on it, and the rest of it's just covered in white siding. And I've mentioned this in other videos, but there's other channels, other creators, other videos that will talk about this architecture dating back to the Bible people, and there's a lot of truth there, but then they'll either use that truth to kind of hook you and then lead you into saying, but Jesus isn't real, that's just a metaphor for the actual sun shining up there. But another thing that I've seen these people do is they'll feed you that truth, hook you with it, and then try and tell you that the millennium has already happened. And because as prophesied by prophets, there was to be a restoration of God's gospel, of his ways, of his teachings, which that's what Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon was. And then there was a failure there of sorts. And then now we're in a period of chastening until there will eventually Christ will come again, the second coming, and that will start the millennium, which is 1,000 years of peace and prosperity and not falling for the evils and the deceptions of the devil. But these other people will try and tell you that that's already happened, that the millennium is where this architecture comes from, and etc. But that's not the case. It's another lie. It's another deception. The story is Joseph Smith, Book of Mormon. God gave us a chance. He gave humanity a chance again, and they didn't quite hack it. And so there's been a little bit of a wiping out, a little bit of a reset, some people call it, and in another state of darkness, and we're in another state of deception, but still there's a lot of truth there that we have been able to hang on to, for anybody who has wanted. And Christ will come again, and it's our job to discern these times. And look, if the current state of the world, I'm making this video in August of 2021, the past year and a half has been a very clear sign of where we're at, where the world's at, how many lies there actually are being fed to us from all the big organizations, whether that's a church, a school, a government. And it's up to us to discern and figure these things out and find the truth and live accordingly. And the millennium is still coming. Christ hasn't come yet. Just like it says in the Book of Mormon, Christ was crucified and resurrected, and then he went to visit other people. Those other people had been for a long time told that Christ would come and visit them. But we're also told about those people that there were people that went amongst them and told them that it had already happened, or that it's too late and it's not going to happen, that the time had already passed, and many were deceived by those teachings. And that's why God had Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon so that we have those stories, so that we can discern what's happening right now. So when someone says the millennium already happened, no, it hasn't happened yet. So when someone says the time's already passed, no, it hasn't passed yet. So when someone says Jesus is just a metaphor for the Son, no, he's the real Son of God in a flesh body. So we're not deceived. And so that we can prepare for when he comes, so that we finally can build and live in God's kingdom here on earth. And we've been warned in the scriptures that the deception will be great in these end times before Christ comes again, before the second coming, before the ushering in of the millennium, that even the elect will be deceived. And like it says in the Bible, when it says, "Upon this rock I will build my church," it's referring to the previous verse where it talks about those who follow the Spirit. Because in such deep, heavy times of deception, those who seek and follow God's Spirit, that will be his church. Not some corporation, not some government, not some church, not science. In the times of great deception at the end, the church will be those who believe in Christ and follow his Spirit. If you haven't read the Book of Mormon, read it. Not just to page 1 through whatever, read it as fast as possible. And it's not like a school textbook, just get through it, but like actually read it, take it a little bit at a time and understand it and compare it to now and figure out what it says about now and the explanations of what happened in the past, because it will explain it. why this architecture sitting everywhere, what happened to the people that built it, and then what's our situation currently, and what do we have to expect moving forward, and why the Book of Mormon talks about Nephites and Lamanites. And then when you go into our New York State Capitol building, there's murals that perfectly match how Nephites and Lamanites are described in the Book of Mormon. And it's a real simple explanation. It's because those are the people that built the stuff, and we've just been deceived.